March 18, 1945. Over the Rhine. The morning sky stretched in a pale, bruised blue above occupied Germany. But inside the belly of the B-26 Marauder, the atmosphere felt nothing like dawn. It felt tight, silent, and shaped by the weight of thousands of unseen dangers. The aircraft vibrated with a steady metallic shiver, a reminder that this machine had already survived more missions than most pilots did. Every bolt hummed, every panel rattled, every sound whispered its own warning. To someone watching from the ground, the bomber looked like a confident shape moving across the sky. For the crew inside, it felt like a floating coffin carried by two engines that could quit at any moment. 19-year-old Daniel Keene sat strapped at the auxiliary control station, staring at the condensation gathering around the edges of the canopy glass. The moisture caught the light in trembling beads, almost like the aircraft was sweating along with him. This was his first mission, his first step into a war that had already consumed millions. He had trained, he had waited, and he had studied every manual late into the night until his vision blurred. But none of that had prepared him for the sound that haunted every new crewman on his first flight. Silence. Not peaceful silence. Not comforting silence. The quiet of men too afraid to speak. If you love stories like this, real courage, real history, then don't just watch, become part of it. Subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends and stand with the people who keep this history alive. Most of the crew were older by 5, 10, sometimes 15 years. Veterans of countless flights. Survivors of a type of bomber that the Army Air Forces tried to defend and praise. But the men had given it another name, one they whispered in the hangars and barracks when officers were not around. The Widow Maker. The kind of aircraft that punished hesitation and erased mistakes with instant finality. The kind of aircraft Daniel had hoped he would never fly. The engines roared harder as the bomber climbed. The smell of oil, grease, and warm metal filled the cabin. The navigator hunched over his map, tracing a planned route with a pencil that shook slightly each time the bomber jolted. Daniel could see the tension in the crew's faces as they settled into their positions. These men knew enough to fear calm skies. Clear mornings only meant that the enemy had an easier time seeing you. And today, the skies were painfully clear. The Rhine glimmered beneath them like a twisting blade. Their mission briefing had described this as a simple reconnaissance run. Nothing dramatic. Nothing too dangerous. Something any rookie could handle. That line had stayed with Daniel from the moment he heard it. Usually when the officers said a mission was simple, the veterans raised their eyebrows. Today had been no different. As the B-26 leveled out on course, the crew scanned the sky, the ground, the horizon. Daniel tightened his grip on the yoke beside him, even though he was not the one flying yet. He wanted to be ready. He wanted to be useful. He wanted this first moment in the air to justify the years of effort that had carried him here. But beneath the surface of that determination, something else lingered. A strange sense that something was wrong. The engines sounded healthy, but odd sounds kept rising beneath the mechanical hum. A vibration that did not feel familiar. A shift in the air pressure that felt just a bit too sharp. Daniel kept glancing toward Captain Ford, hoping to read some reassurance. But the captain kept his expression locked in the calm look that experienced pilots wore to comfort younger ones. It did not comfort Daniel. It only made him more suspicious of the danger the captain was trying to hide. The first hint of trouble surfaced when the radio crackled. At first it seemed like static, but then the fragments of sharp German syllables cut through the cabin. Daniel saw the navigator freeze. The man did not speak German fluently, but he recognized enough to understand that the enemy was talking about flight paths. The crew exchanged glances. The planned route was supposed to be clear. Intelligence had marked it as low risk. Yet the radio chatter suggested something entirely different. Daniel could feel the realization growing inside the aircraft like a slow, tightening grip around the throat. They were headed directly toward a hidden flak position. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Even Captain Ford stayed silent, processing what the radio was telling him. The Marauder kept slicing through the sky, but now every second felt heavier. The calm morning had been a lie. The mission briefing had been incomplete. Or worse, Someone had known exactly where they would be and had passed that information to the enemy. There were no answers in the aircraft, only fear pushing up like a cold tide. Then the navigator lifted his eyes and gave a single, grim nod to the captain. That was all Ford needed. He gripped the controls tighter and pulled the aircraft slightly left. It was not a drastic change, just enough to take a different approach angle. But the tension inside the bomber thickened. Every man understood they were flying into a trap. The Marauder began to quiver as the engines strained harder. The bolts rattled. The airframe groaned. Daniel tried to swallow, but his mouth had gone dry. He could hear his heartbeat pounding against the inside of his headset. He thought about the stories he had heard during training. Stories of first missions ending in fire. Stories of pilots who never made it back. Stories of crewmen who surrendered to terror long before flak shells touched them. Daniel kept his hands locked on the yoke beside Ford, ready to follow any command. The sky ahead brightened slightly, but there was something unnatural about the stillness. Birds were absent. The air looked too smooth. Even the wind seemed to avoid this part of the sky. Daniel studied the landscape below. The roads were empty. The fields looked abandoned. A small column of smoke drifted in the far distance, barely noticeable. But it was there, a sign of guns that had recently fired. Something tightened inside Daniel, a feeling that this moment was about to split open in a way he could not predict. This was the hook, the moment the danger became real. And now, just as the tension reached its peak, the narrator's voice would guide viewers toward the call to action. If you are watching this and you feel the weight of the air around young Daniel rising with every second, please take a moment to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and comment where in the world you are watching from. Your support keeps stories like this alive and helps us bring forgotten bravery back into the light. The B-26 continued its quiet, ominous flight. The enemy still had not revealed itself. That was the worst part. The veterans feared the unseen more than anything visible. A fighter could be dodged. A flak shell could be outmaneuvered. But an invisible threat stayed in the air like a whisper waiting to become a scream. Suddenly, the radio hissed again, more violently this time. The static rose into a sharp pulse. Ford called for all stations to stay alert. Daniel leaned forward instinctively, scanning the horizon. The sun reflected off something metallic in the distance. A flash, then another. The navigator inhaled sharply. They were not random glints of light. They were gun shields, camouflaged, hidden, perfectly positioned to strike. Daniel felt the tension snap in his chest. They were flying straight into the jaws of an ambush, and the crew had only seconds to react. The sky remained calm. The engines roared on, but the trap had finally revealed itself. And the real terror was only beginning. The trap did not reveal itself with a dramatic explosion, not at first. It began with a subtle flicker of movement among the trees below. Daniel noticed it while scanning the terrain, a tiny ripple across the forest line where nothing should have moved. It was the kind of detail only a rookie would focus on. Veterans usually stared at the sky, not the ground. But something about that shifting darkness caught Daniel's attention. Before he could speak, the world beneath them erupted. A blast of orange light tore through the morning haze as the first 88mm flak shell detonated. The shock wave struck the Marauder with a violent shove that rattled every rib in Daniel's chest. A second explosion followed instantly, then a third, forming a deadly staircase of fire rising into the air. The flak nest had been waiting. The crew understood that, in the same moment, they had flown into a carefully timed kill zone. Captain Ford jerked the controls and began a defensive bank, but the first hit had already thrown the aircraft off balance. The Marauder shook with a deep metallic moan, the kind that suggested the airframe was absorbing stress it was never meant to withstand. The right engine sputtered for a fraction of a second, then steadied itself. Daniel gripped the auxiliary control yoke, ready to take pressure off the captain whenever needed. He felt the aircraft leaning into an unnatural angle. He felt the tremors of the wind tearing at the wings. He felt the heat from the flak bursts creeping closer. More shells tore upward in black, skull-shaped clouds. They exploded with hollow thuds that shook the bomber like a toy held in a giant's fist. Shrapnel scraped across the fuselage. Every impact sounded like a handful of rocks being hurled against steel. Daniel tried to keep his breathing steady, but every jolt made his throat tighten. The veterans worked through the chaos with the efficiency of men who had survived too many missions to hesitate now. The navigator called altitudes. The bombardier scanned for enemy fighters. The tail gunner searched the sky with a desperate precision. No one shouted. No one panicked. They simply executed their roles while death circled them. Daniel felt something shifting in the vibration of the aircraft. A different kind of tremor. A deep rumbling that seemed to crawl up from the floor of the fuselage. He turned toward the right engine just as a bright spear of light cut across it. A shell had grazed the cowling. Flames shot out like a tongue of fire licking the wind. The engine coughed with a sickening sputter that echoed through the entire airframe. And came the hit they all feared. An 88mm shell exploded against the right engine with a violent burst of heat and smoke. The Marauder lurched to the right, dropping altitude rapidly. Daniel felt the weight pull him sideways, hard enough to strain his harness. The cabin filled with smoke. The captain struggled to keep the bomber level, wrestling the yoke with both hands. Daniel instinctively reached for the auxiliary controls, bracing himself as the bomber began to roll. The smell of burning oil filled the air. The right engine spat flame as pieces of shrapnel tore away from its housing. The aircraft dipped into a dangerous descent. The left engine roared louder, as if fighting to carry the weight of the whole bomber alone. Daniel could feel the Marauder resisting the captain's pull. Something inside the control system had been damaged. The rudder lagged. The throttle linkage groaned. The bomber felt like it was slipping out of Ford's hands. The radio crackled again. More German chatter. This time Daniel could hear excitement in the tone. The enemy on the ground knew they had crippled the aircraft. The flak batteries adjusted their timing. The next shells exploded closer. The sky became a storm of black shrapnel clouds rising around them like hungry shadows. Daniel felt his pulse hammering in his ears. His hands tightened on the yoke. Something told him he might be needed sooner than expected. Ford called for evasive maneuvers, forcing the bomber into a twisting dive that pulled them away from the heaviest flak. The Marauder dropped hundreds of feet in a matter of seconds, the air screaming across the fuselage. Daniel looked down. The treetops blurred beneath him. The ground seemed to tilt upward. The aircraft was moving too fast, too low, too unstable. The second twist arrived on wings of silver and fury. A German fighter appeared from the glare of the morning sun, hurtling downward in a steep dive. Daniel saw it before anyone else. The shape cut through the light like a blade. Its wings glimmered. Its guns flared with sudden streaks of fire. The engine noise of the fighter reached them only after the bullets had already torn across the bomber's tail section. The tail gunner fired back, sending bright orange tracers into the sky. But the fighter was fast, diving straight toward them. Daniel could feel the Marauder jolting with each burst of incoming fire. The bomber could not take much more, for it struggled to regain altitude. But the damaged engine and the incoming fighter pinned them into a deadly angle. The fighter grew larger in the canopy's glass. Daniel could see the pilot's silhouette. He could see the muzzle flashes. He could see the lines of smoke left by the bullets slicing through the air. The Marauder trembled as more rounds struck the fuselage. Daniel felt the moment tightening around him. The aircraft was falling too quickly. The fighter was approaching too fast. The flak was still rising. Everything was converging toward a single impossible instant. Daniel reached for the yoke again. His hands moved instinctively, as if driven by something deeper than training. The bomber slipped into a sharper descent. Ford fought the controls, but Daniel felt the pivot point inside the aircraft shift. The Marauder seemed to hesitate for a split second, caught between the captain's intention and Daniel's instinct. The fighter closed the distance. The flak climbed higher. The bomber dropped faster. Daniel leaned forward as if bracing for impact. The world around him narrowed to the glowing instrument panel, the tremble of the yoke beneath his fingers, and the growing roar of the fighter descending behind him. The Marauder was seconds away from a hit that would tear it in half. And in that last moment, before everything collided, Daniel felt something inside himself snap into place. The fear did not vanish. It sharpened. It focused. It moved through his body with the clarity of a new instinct. He sensed the weight of the bomber. He sensed the tension in the controls. He sensed a narrow path through the chaos. The next move would define everything that followed. But no one in the aircraft yet understood that Daniel was about to make a decision that had never existed in any manual, any briefing, or any wartime strategy. A decision born of panic. A decision born of instinct. A decision that would create a tactic no bomber crew had ever dared to attempt before. The bomber hung in the sky, trembling on the edge of disaster. The enemy fighter locked on. The ground rose closer, and Daniel's hands began to push the yoke forward. A choice made in fear. A move no one expected. A moment about to rewrite the sky. The yoke moved forward under Daniel's trembling hands, not with confidence, but with a desperate instinct rising out of fear. The Marauder reacted instantly. Its nose dipped into a steeper angle, and the aircraft lunged downward like a stone breaking free from a cliff. The sudden dive forced a burst of cold air through the fuselage, as gravity clutched the crew and pinned them hard into their straps. The altimeter needle spun downward in a blur. The wind outside grew louder, howling against the bomber's wounded frame. No one on board understood what Daniel had just done. Not yet. To them, it looked like the action of a terrified rookie losing control. But the German fighter behind them reacted very differently. The pilot, expecting the bomber to level out or turn, suddenly faced a target that had become unpredictable. The Marauder's sharp descent forced him to overshoot. His gunfire streaked over the top of the bomber, cutting through empty air. Daniel could not hear the fighter scream past, but he felt the shift in pressure as it rushed overhead. The aircraft shook with the wake turbulence, rattling every loose panel. The dive accelerated, driving the Marauder directly toward the flak batteries below. Ford tried to pull the aircraft back to a safer angle, but the damaged control system resisted him. Daniel sensed the captain struggling beside him, but something inside the young airman refused to let go. His instincts clung to the yoke with a strange clarity. The bomber needed speed. It needed unpredictability. It needed to move in a way no bomber ever had before. The flak gunners below panicked as the wounded B-26 plunged toward them. Their guns had been calibrated for a bomber traveling at a steady speed and altitude. This dive threw their calculations into chaos. Shells exploded behind and beside the aircraft instead of in front of it. A staircase of black smoke kept climbing, but the bomber moved too fast, too steep, and too erratic for the gunners to reorient in time. Daniel felt the vibration of the airframe grow harsher, like the aircraft was tearing itself apart under the stress. The dive became so steep that the crew could see the treetops rising toward the glass. Buildings and armored positions blurred into streaks of gray and green. The ground looked close enough to touch. The Marauder had become a falling spear, slicing through air that felt thicker with every passing second. The crew shouted warnings, but their voices were swallowed by the roar of the descent. Ford struggled to pull the aircraft up, the muscles in his arms straining against the yoke. Daniel, still gripping the controls, felt a strange calm spread through him. It was the calm of someone who had already surrendered to the moment, the calm of someone who believed there was no turning back. He waited. He watched. He felt for the narrow margin where instinct and fate would meet. At 400 feet, with the ground racing toward them in a blur, Daniel pulled up. The yoke fought back at first, resisting the climb, but then the bomber responded with a sudden, violent jerk that sent every loose object flying through the cabin. The aircraft skimmed the treetops, clipping branches that snapped against the fuselage with the sound of cracking bones. For a brief moment, the bomber seemed to hover between survival and destruction. Then it surged upward again, riding the momentum of the dive like a slingshot. Behind them, the German fighter attempted to follow the maneuver. Its pilot expected a typical evasive turn or a gradual descent, not a suicidal plunge into the very teeth of the flak zone. When he tried to mimic the dive, he found himself closing the distance too quickly. His fighter shook under the strain. He fought the stick, trying to stabilize his aim. Smoke trails spiraled around him as he rushed after the bomber. He did not see the second fighter coming from his right. Daniel never saw what happened. The crew only felt the shockwave when the two German aircraft collided midair. A flash of sparks bloomed in the sky. Wreckage spun downward in burning fragments that tumbled into the forest. The explosion lit the morning briefly, scattering black smoke across the horizon. The crew inside the Marauder stared at one another in disbelief. In the chaos of the dive, they had been seconds away from death, yet the accident had destroyed the fighters that should have finished them. Even Ford looked stunned, as if trying to understand what force had guided the last moments. The bomber climbed only a short distance before the left engine sputtered. Without the balance of the right engine, the airframe began to drag sideways. Daniel adjusted his grip, feeling the controls resist each movement. Ford regained command of the yoke, but Daniel's accidental maneuver had already altered everything. The crew now saw him differently, not as a rookie, not as a burden, but as the young airman whose instinct had saved them when nothing else could have. Smoke trailed from the damaged engine as the aircraft limped out of the flak zone. The skies grew quieter. The Rhine curved below them like a silver scar. The crew could now hear the faint ticking of loose metal vibrating inside the wing. After so much noise, the sudden calm felt unreal. Daniel's breathing steadied slowly. The fear that had driven him moments earlier receded, replaced by a strange heaviness in his chest. He looked at the controls. He looked at the sky. He looked at the treetops still swaying beneath him. He could not explain what he had done. He could not explain why he had pushed the nose down instead of pulling up. He could not explain how a move born of panic had turned into the only decision that kept them alive. Ford finally spoke, though Daniel would remember the silence between them more than the words that followed. The crew returned to their stations, shaken but alive. The bomber crawled across the sky, like a wounded animal trying to find its way home. Every mile felt longer than the last. Every vibration felt like a warning. Every gust of wind felt like a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. When the aircraft finally crossed friendly lines, the crew allowed themselves a single breath of relief. The landing was rough, but it held. The tires screeched against the runway. The crippled bomber groaned under its own weight as it came to a stop. Ground crews rushed toward them, stunned by the damage. The entire right engine was blackened. Shrapnel holes peppered the fuselage. The tail section looked like a metal skeleton stripped of its skin. Daniel climbed out last. The sunlight hit him with a strange warmth. His legs trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the slow realization of what had taken place in the air above the Rhine. He tried to make sense of it, but the truth felt too slippery to grasp. He felt both responsible and confused, lucky and cursed, brave and terrified. Hours later, after the crew had filed their reports, intelligence officers began piecing together what had unfolded. The flak batteries recorded the dive in real time. The fighter pilots who survived the clash reported a bomber maneuver they had never witnessed before. Analysts studied the trajectory, the airspeed, and the timing. They concluded that the dive had broken the precision tracking of the flak guns. It had disrupted the coordination of the intercepting fighters. It had thrown the enemy into confusion by doing something no bomber was ever designed to do. They called it vertical disruption maneuvering. The crew called it something else, Keen's drop. But whispers eventually spread among the officers. Whispers that the mission route had been leaked. Whispers that the ambush had been too perfectly arranged. Whispers that someone within the intelligence chain might have known more than their report suggested. Daniel never learned the truth. He carried the questions for the rest of his life. Was the dive pure instinct? Was it fate? Was it something darker watching over him? Or was it the kind of miracle that only happens once in the broken sky of a dying war? No historian ever answered those questions with certainty. And perhaps that is why the story has remained alive. Because some moments in war refuse to fit perfectly into logic. They balance between courage and fear, between chance and destiny, between human instinct and something beyond understanding. Daniel's accidental tactic would influence aircraft maneuver theory long after the war ended. Yet the moment itself remained a mystery shaped by fire, desperation, and the trembling hands of a 19-year-old rookie who refused to let go when the world fell apart around him. To this day, No one knows who leaked the mission route. To this day, no one knows whether the dive was luck or instinct. To this day, no one knows whether the sky chose to spare him. But the legacy of that morning still echoes across every war story that begins with ordinary men facing impossible choices. And if his hands had not moved when they did, that bomber would have vanished into flames over the Rhine, remembered only as another casualty in the endless list of unnamed losses. Instead, his accident became a tactic. His fear became a turning point. And his first mission became the moment that changed everything. As you reflect on the courage of that young airman and the mysterious force that seemed to guide him through the smoke-filled sky, please take a moment to share your thoughts. And if this story moved you, please share, like, comment, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends for more unforgettable tales of bravery and fate. Your support helps us keep these stories alive.